Welcome to today's show. My name is Glenn Diesen. With me is the great Alexander Mercouris, and the guest today is none other than Sergey Karaganov, who has been a presidential advisor to both Yeltsin and President Putin, head of the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. And for full disclosure, you were also my boss at the Higher School of Economics as the head of departments. So welcome, Professor Karaganov. It's very good to see you again.
It's good to see you here.
So
yesterday we celebrated, Orthodox Christmas. It is still the holiday season. So I'm congratulating on all the holidays we are passing. In Russia, we'll have another one on the 13th of December. Of January, which is called the Old New Year, Old Style. So it's not ended here. We are always celebrating.
Well, yeah, Merry Christmas as well. I should have opened with that. So anyways, the topic of discussion today is how Russia has shifted from this Greater Europe initiative to the Greater Eurasian Partnership. And how this is not only contributing, but I would argue is spearheading the construction of a new world as well. So just to define the terms, Greater Europe then refers to Russia's former goal of constructing an inclusive European security architecture after the Cold War, one which would also include Russia, while Greater Eurasia is now this larger construct in which Russia aims to develop more economic connectivity with the countries in the East instead. Professor Karaganov and Alexander, perhaps we can start with the origin of the current crisis that led to this collapse of the Greater Europe Initiative, which was the failure to establish a mutually acceptable post-Cold War settlement. And as you have written, Karaganov, NATO attempted to impose a new Treaty of Versailles on Russia. I was wondering if you can elaborate on how you see what went wrong after the Cold War.
Is this a question?
Yes.
I was sure that we'll come to a direct confrontation or to a crisis and direct confrontation since 1996, and I went on record. And that is the time when NATO started to expand. I was absolutely amazed at that time because I thought that the Russian offer of being partially integrated on acceptable terms was so beneficial to the West, so he couldn't have rejected it, but it's rejected it. And so I was afraid that the West decided to believe a coup de grace. The worst mistake in Russian foreign policy was made in 1997 when we signed because of weakness and also still illusions, the founding act on Russia and NATO, which legitimized further NATO expansion. From now on, I was trying to avoid, desperately trying to avoid the inevitable, the showdown. So we could go, further. I could give you, a few examples and a few milestones, but it started there. And I'm extremely sad that I was right. 25 years ago, but it is inevitable march of history. Could that have been otherwise? Yes. If we would have been more clever, more generous, and more thoughtful.
Yeah. So the agreement you refer to is the NATO-Russia Founding Act. This was seen as by NATO as an effort to get Russia to approve of NATO expansion. Of course, NATO had already decided to expand. What was the motivation, or why did Russia sign this? Because there's some comments by Bill Clinton, was quite crude actually, when he looked at the agreement. He more or less said, well, so this means we have no commitments to Russia whatsoever, and if we wake up tomorrow and change our mind and want to ignore these agreements with Russia, we can do so. So what made Russia sign these agreements, given that?
No, well, there were many reasons, but one was, tremendous economic weakness and dependence on Western funds and Western markets, and it was probably 60-75%, depending on whom you would ask. 40% was still, I believe, that we could find a fair agreement with our Western neighbors. At that time, these feelings were still, the expectations were still relatively strong in Russia. People like myself, but there were a few. Most of them were out of the establishment. Believe that is impossible, but in the ruling elite, the majority were still willing to think that we could have a fair arrangement with the West. I blame myself for not being too hard and too harsh in explaining to my colleagues in the elite of Russia how bad things could be. But I wrote that and I said that. But then things started to unravel, and the crack came. The first crack came in 1999 when NATO bombed former Yugoslavia. Then it went over and over. And by 2008, it was absolutely clear that we are moving towards a showdown.
Can I just add to all of this? Because of course I live in Britain, and I remember all of this period very much from the British side. And I remember going to a meeting at that time. This is in London University, and there was a person there. I'm not going to say who it was. I don't want to embarrass them. But he actually referred to this treaty that there had been with the Russians, the NATO-Russia Founding Act Treaty. He said it is an unequal treaty. He was actually using the expression that is used by the Chinese to describe the treaties that the Western powers were imposed upon China in the 19th century. And he used that perfectly well understanding what that phrase meant. And it was a treaty, in effect, to a great extent, imposed on the Russians, because the Russians were being presented with this fait accompli. NATO was going to be expanded anyway. And they were told, look, you have to accept this. If you want something, a face-saving formula, you're going to accept this treaty. The problem with unequal treaties is that they are unsustainable. It was bound sooner or later to come apart because it was something that was imposed. And it was very extraordinary that the Western political elite at that time couldn't understand this, couldn't see it for themselves. And I think that Professor Karaganov has just explained about the financial dependence upon the West that existed in Russia at that time. I'm going to say that the alarm bells began ringing in the West very loudly, much earlier than many people realize. Firstly, they began with the campaign in Chechnya in 1999. But they began to ring even more loudly when it became clear that the Russians were starting to take measures to sort out their control over their oil and gas and energy wealth in the early 2000s. And that by doing so, they would start to put their financial house in order and start to become less dependent on the West. I can again remember tracking coverage in Britain at the time. And it was very striking that this is the period of time in which a lot of the narratives about the Putin government, about Putin personally, about the change in Russia, about the move in Russia towards a supposedly more authoritarian, anti-Western position began to take off. And I think from that moment, there was still some uncertainty in the West about how to handle this thing, this change in Russian policy, this reorientation in Russian policy. But I think there was also a growing hostility, and this began, as I said, in the early 2000s.
Well, first of all, I mean, thank you for your analysis. I agree with it 95%. I mean, 5% being, the nuances. You're right. As to the nuances, Russia was dependent on two levels. First, it had a huge debt accumulated during Gorbachev times and during early times, which was amounted to, I think, 120 billion at that time, which it had to serve. Otherwise, it would be cut off other funds. This was done away with by Putin only at the beginning of the 2000s, and it was one of his aims from the beginning. So the country was hanging on a very thin rope. And the second was, of course, of a different kind, and they were still suffering from it. Russia imposed capitalism now because of inadequateness of our elite, which is mostly due, of course, to communist unanimity. We didn't understand the world. Now, we impose capitalism without law. So all monies which people earned, even decently, had to be somehow defended, not by law and by system, but either by bandits or the government, which sometimes was the same, that was a source of corruption, or siphoned off abroad. And so thus, by mid 90s and late 90s, we created a huge comprador class, which was not, people were not anti-patriotic, but they were made anti-patriotic. They were totally dependent. So the whole, most of the Russian elite was dependent on the money or which they had siphoned off to the West. So it was a very complicated situation. Very few people understood that at that time, but some understood. And I think from 1999 on, we started to get rid of that. But it was a very hard process. I could assure you, including, hard intellectually, politically, and physically.
I was curious. I want to ask about an interview you did with Spiegel. I think it was back in 2016, because obviously Russia was going through this economic crisis, which was taken advantage of to some extent, but also it was the possibility of a common security architecture, which was rejected, because first Russia, of course, wanted to have the ODYSEE, but then that was rejected in the West. Both Yeltsin and Putin suggested Russia could join NATO. That was also not of interest in the West. And of course, you had thereafter everything from President Medvedev suggesting a new security architecture, Putin's argument of an EU-Russian union to some extent, but at the same time, while the West was kind of rejecting all common European architectures with Russia, Russia also began to lose a bit interest in Europe in terms, as you argued once, that West became less and less a role model for Russia to model itself after. Was that mostly economic or social, cultural, moral? How do you see?
Professor Diesen, first of all, I read your books, so they're illuminating. So you know most of the answers. But I will give my interpretation. At first, there was, of course, we were dissatisfied with the political security role we were assigned within that system. So it was a Versailles treaty in soft gloves, or velvet gloves. But still, I mean, most of the Russian elite was dependent economically on the West. We were allegedly penetrated by new ideas, old ideas from the West. So most of the intellectual elite, not all, but most of the intellectual elite linked themselves to the West. But still, I mean, there was also a notion that we were turning to Europe. And Europe in the Russian public mind, or in the Russian intellectual mind, was a land of affluence, land of freedom, land of culture, land of beauty. We'll know that now, of course, and I knew that even at that time, that, of course, while all these notions are partly true, they were not everything. But people didn't want to think about that at that time. So at first we wanted to integrate with Europe, not into Europe, because we understood that we are too sovereign, too big, and too proud to become one of the European nations. Or else like Britain. We couldn't have, but we were a very big Britain and much more powerful. That was the first crack. And then came the second crack, when we understood that the West is, in security and political terms, is imposing unequal or even dangerous schemes on European security order. I was one of the authors of I helped to develop the Gorbachev's Common European Home. Then I helped to develop many ideas as to how to bring Europe and Russia together. But then I am coming to the third element of political, economic, and then moral. In my mind, or for me personally, I decided to finish off my great European project in which I invested 2 decades of my life, when Europe rejected Christianity. Do you remember debates about European Constitution in 2002? Mm-hmm. And then the project, which was put forward by the group which was headed by, I think, Giscard d'Estaing, after all things was handled, and I saw that there was no mention of Christianity. For me, that was the end of Europe. From that point, I have written it off. And then we saw, I mean, the second element of the dissociation of Europe and Russia, and that is new or post-European, as I call it, or if I very unkind, post-human values, which are taking over many European elites. You know about this. A rejection of history, sex, nation of everything which I consider to be human. But that was very gradually building up, and that notion of moral dissociation flared up only in 2010, in 2010s. First on security, second. Yes, by the way, of course, I didn't mention the fact that we saw that the economic relations with Europe were unequal or sometimes unfair, or though, of course, a lot of people benefited from them. So there was a gradual growth of irritation of the terms of our economic relations with Europe. That's why people like myself and Diesen knows some of others at the end of the 2000s started to argue for gradual change of balance of our trade and economic relations towards the East. That was the start of the Eastern term. But I knew that there would be a showdown on security, but I hope it could have been avoided in its roughest terms like we have now. And I knew that, of course, that we are parting culturally and socially, but that was building up over years. By the early 2010s, I was absolutely sure that we have parted. Now we have parted in a very different way.
Can I ask a question here, Professor Karaganov?
Urgent for 1 second, please.
Of course. I was wondering if I could ask a question, because one of the puzzles I have is that certainly in the West, to say it's very straightforwardly, most Westerners, in my experience, have very little knowledge of today's Russia. And I mean, that is absolutely the case. And of course, it affects policy. There's a great misunderstandings about, for example, the scale of the Russian economy that influenced decisions going over many years. We saw the culmination in the sanctions attempts at the start of this year. But it also seems to me that a lot of Russians, an awful lot of Russians, haven't known very much about Europe and have been idealizing Europe for a very long time. Now, how did that happen? Is it because people didn't travel to Europe much through the Soviet times? Could it be, and this is just a question, and I'm just, that Russians' conception of Europe is ultimately a cultural one through access to European culture, to literature, to art, and that this being a literature and art that really is in the past misinformed Russians about the changes that have been happening in Europe today since the 1960s. Because what you talked about the sort of post-human changes, for example, I mean, you could see those kind of processes in Europe starting in the 1960s, but Russians don't seem to have been aware of them. So is this the case? I mean, do you think that Russians were unaware of this? I mean, is it partly what I was saying, that, as I said, it's partly because the Russians have a cultural understanding of Europe, which is perhaps a little out of date sometimes? Just this is just a question.
I mean, you are absolutely correct. And I have been fighting with this notion of living with this notion for decades. I have been one of the very few in Russia who partly understood where Europe was going, what was it. But even for myself, Europe was the country of Shakespeare, Stendhal, Dante, great monuments and beautiful architecture of Beethoven. We didn't have an understanding of how Europe was developing, and that was partly to this intellectual unanimity or intellectual thoughtfulness, which was imposed by the communist system. But many people in Europe also didn't understand what was happening in Europe too, and that was a part of our problem. We did not understand where Europe or the West was moving. We were moving towards our ideal of what Europe should have been. And that was a huge cultural mistake, which is now being corrected very swiftly, but by very harsh ways. As to the misunderstanding of the West or what is happening in Russia, that is very close to what we have had during the Soviet times. We were closed intellectually, politically, from Europeans. So we had very, very narrow access of communications. Now our European and Western neighbors are cutting all kind of connections with Russia. Russia is absolutely different from what I read in the Western press, to the extent that I could subscribe to it, because it is sometimes impossible to subscribe to Western newspapers or Western media. So it's unbelievable. It's worse than in Soviet times. I may imagine myself having a problem of subscribing to the usual newspapers and magazines, which I have been reading for 50 years. Even in Soviet times, I had this, because I was a scholar, I had some kind of access to this press. Of course, there is internet, but as you know, the internet is less and less reliable as a source of information. But nevertheless, I mean, of course, not everything is bad. We are starting to understand what Europe is. But unfortunately, now, instead of ideal picture of what Europe used to be, now we have more or less a negative picture. I don't think that people like you, if I understand you well, I don't you, or Diesen, or millions and millions of European intellectuals and citizens share the views of these strange anti-European and anti-human elites. I'm not blaming, or I'm not accusing, or it's not a political statement, but the picture of Europe is also becoming distorted here.
Well, when you speak of this divorce, if you will, between Europe and Russia, I was wondering, does it in what areas? Because if you look in economics, I guess it's very easy to look at clear indicators. I mean, in Europe, there's always this obsession about ridding ourselves of Russian energy, even though it fuels our industries and economies. But for Russia, they've always been very dependent on a lot of Western technologies and industries, and transportation corridors, the banks, the currencies, payment systems. Now all of this seems to be Russia developing either its own competencies or finding alternative partners in the East. I was just wondering, are there any other areas where we see Russia and well, Russia and Europe breaking apart to the extent that actually Europe is losing a lot of the former influence it had in Russia because of this dependency?
Well, first of all, this process is painful, but it is for the better. Absolutely. Yes, we have to suffer some loss for several years, but we are really now redirecting our economic, intellectual, etc. Efforts and social efforts towards first ourselves and second towards the East. The period which I call the Peter the Great period has finished. It has given Russia a lot. There are people in Russia who try to discard the legacy of Peter the Great and of the Europeanization of Russia. I do not share their views because without Peter the Great and his educational effort of his successors, there wouldn't have been one of the greatest literatures and cultures in the world. However, now we are parting, for a long period of time. It is sad, but it is necessary for the Russian development too. And I'm traveling now more and more, as many Russians do, around Russia. It's a very comfortable place. It's in small cities or towns, you have excellent restaurants, clean toilets, by the way, nice hotels. And a few weeks ago, I went to Siberia, and there I saw the unbelievable intellectual curiosity and growth. And so I've been to several places like Novosibirsk and Tomsk, and I saw the industry which is rapidly growing at last. So it will be a very hard period for Russia because we are tearing many established links, and including technological. But I see that the technological genius of Russia is returning back just in front of my eyes. And I would say that apart from this terrible suffering in Ukraine, death of tens of thousands of soldiers and citizens, the process is going in the right direction. But that's history. We're in the right direction, and eventually, what has been happening here socially is we are getting rid from the class of compradors and from the class of what people in the press call the fifth column, pro-Western, senseless pro-Western intellectuals and others. They have immigrated without much oppression. Intellectually, I keep my fingers crossed, we are still the freest country in Europe, I hope. And Professor Diesen, who used to be working with the Faculty of World Economics and International Affairs at the High School of Economics, which I used to head, now I'm the scientific supervisor of that. I can assure you that our level of discussions is increasing, quality of discussions, and the freedom of discussions. There are some limits, but they're much less obvious than in most of the countries of the world.
So you mentioned the conflict in Ukraine, because to a large extent this has spearheaded a lot of this development of Russia's pivot to the east, if you will, because well, first of all, one could argue that when the West toppled the government in Kyiv in 2014, this is when Russia, to a large extent, gave up on this Greater Europe initiative and began to really push hard to the east, even though it already had initiatives ahead of this. But I think what's interesting in this crisis was not just this assumption we had in the West that somehow we're going to turn on sanctions on Russia and the economy would collapse by the weekend. Obviously, none of this worked. But another big shock which came in the West was hardly any countries outside of NATO joined these sanctions. I mean, from China, India, well, almost all of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, no one joined it. And even more extraordinary, whenever countries like India is being confronted or pressured, they essentially just brush it off and say, well, this is our interest, and also we don't necessarily see your moral authority here. It's been quite interesting, and also some of the economic ties and connectivity has intensified very quickly now. Especially Russia, India. This has been a very interesting development, and but now we also see these large institutions which are facilitating cooperation across Greater Eurasia, be it SCO, BRICS, all of it. Instead of walking away from Russia, we see this now. The membership queues are going around the corner. I was just wondering, how do you see this development? Is it will it keep this momentum, or because it's been such a turbulent year? What do you see for 2023? Do you think SCO will take more members? Will the economic patterns keep or connectivity keep changing? Again, I nobody likes to try to look inside the crystal ball, but just a general prediction based on how you see things going.
I think, let's put it this way. You're a world-class political philosopher, but you're still European. You're looking at the situation from a European point of view, which is natural. I mean, all social sciences, whether we admit that or not, be that economics, sociology, history, politology, are basically national, with all kind of course, different providers. As to the direct answer to your question, I'm looking at this story, which is unraveling. Very important. We see the basic, crucial change in the direction of world politics, economics, and social affairs and culture. For over 500 years, or close to 500 years, Europe, to which Russia, by the way, broadly belonged, was dominating the world militarily, and that was the foundation of the domination. Then politically, economically, culturally, and imposing its rules, norms, or whatsoever. That has finished about. That has started to finish in the 1960s or 1970s, when the Soviet Union had developed a military potential which negated the Western military preponderance, so West started to lose wars. But then there was a salto mortale in the 90s, but now again the history is returning. So what is happening in the world is that we have an continuous earthquake for about the next 15 years, I hope. Not more, because earthquake is not a state of affairs. Now, from which we see the emergence or re-emergence of new civilizations and new cultures, new nations, which were neglected in our European, from our European point. So I am very positive about the world in 25 years, so I would not be able to participate in this world. But now for that, and I'm returning back to your question about 2023, we'll have to avoid a catastrophic war. And in Ukraine, we are fighting something of a side war in this general conflict. It's not the core. No, of course, it occupies in our minds. I mean, almost an unbelievable amount of time and it is a side story, but a crucial side story. I mean, sometimes side stories make history. But we are moving towards a new world. I hope that this conflict in Ukraine will at least end the deterioration of European security system. Has been happening for about 25 years. And we would somehow come to an understanding there, because the other parts of the world are also in turmoil. You mentioned India, but there's India, Pakistan, the Arab world. I mean, Africa, which is bursting, etc., etc. So we will have, I mean, for the next 20 for years, for kind of social, food, water, and other climate problems, we'll have a war which will be exploding. In the meantime, we stupid Europeans are concentrating on the problems which are in our immediate vicinity. The Ukrainian problem should and could be solved somehow. That's a separate problem. But as I've said, it's a very, very small but important for us part of a general process.
I mean, can I say that one of the most depressing facts about this crisis, because you talked about the way in which Europe is very absorbed with the Ukrainian crisis, much of what you have been talking about, Professor Karaganov, you will not find discussed at all in any part of the Western media. I mean, very few references there to the BRICS, for example. Hardly any references to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Very little discussion about, multipolar systems, unipolar systems, the kind of language that people, I think, are becoming increasingly accustomed to, not just in Russia, but around the world. A long denial for many years about the rise of China. A long denial for many years about the fact that China and Russia were working together and were forging a relationship with each other. A failure to see a lot of what is going on in Africa. This has been a major shock, if I can say, here in Britain, that African states are now expressing opinions which go against those of the former imperial heartland, which to a great extent, of course, is still in London. Many people in the West, and I don't think this is just the Western public, I think policymakers still see the world very much on the basis that that system that you described at the beginning of your last point, the one that the West still has its overriding hegemony, if you like, military, economic, cultural, that still prevails in some way, and that ultimately all it needs is for us to exert ourselves a little in one place or another, Ukraine in this particular case, and we will eventually prevail. And this is a very difficult thing, because I think that you've described the change, the transition, but I don't think in European capitals there's very much understanding at the moment that we are in that process of transition.
We have a very good interview. It's not an interview, thanks to you. It is an intellectual discussion which we rarely have with the people from the other side of the barricade, which is unbelievable. It's fantastic. It's simply fantastic. Yes, you are right. If being a Russian, I'm happy with the state of intellectual affairs among our Western counterparts. They are on the losing side of intellectual and political history. They do not wish to understand what is happening. That was very much like we were in the 70s and 80s. We were Soviets. But now we are living in a much more interdependent world, not economically, because globalization is cracking, but the world is open, the global problems are everywhere, so I'm not happy about the fact that our Western colleagues refuse to understand the reality. Of course, tactically, we shall win, but strategically, we could, tactically, operationally, we, Russia, the BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation, China, etc. But strategically, the world in this uncertain future could survive only through common effort. At this juncture, I do not see the ability on the part of the Western elites, which had been leading for almost 5 centuries, to understand the new realities. They're clinging to the old realities and to the old recipes. That is lamentable, but also dangerous.
You think this is why there's a resistance towards diplomacy? I'm thinking because, well, to a large extent, the world now is transitioning from what we used to have. I guess I would say the unipolar era is already gone and multipolarity is here. But among some Western elites, you get the impression that, well, also what makes this war in Ukraine quite dangerous is there's this belief that if the West can be victorious in Ukraine, then you can reverse this and restore unipolarity. I would argue that the conflict in its own has, only cemented multipolarity, because now I think a lot of countries around the world has been taken a bit back by the kind of sanctions used and the economic coercion, the trust in the dollar and euro, the banking system, but is this one of the reasons you think why there's no appetite for diplomacy? I mean, only yesterday Russia suggested let's have a ceasefire over Orthodox Christmas, and the Americans rejected it, the EU rejected it, and the Kiev rejected it. And even Borrell, the foreign policy chief of the EU, he said, well, then you're going to have to leave all the territories in Ukraine. So conflating ceasefire with capitulation, it's this whole idea that the negotiations is a naughty word now. and this is not just now, but even before the 7 years of Minsk agreement. This was a way of resolving it, but I think many people here in the West were afraid that it would give way to multipolarity. Or how would you analyze this reluctance in the West? Because throughout history, in the Cold War, whenever there's a chance of a direct war with Russia, everyone wants to step on the brakes and walk it back. But now it's just escalation after escalation. How do you explain this development?
That is a result of social and intellectual degradation of many of the Western elites due to 75 years of living in peace and quiet during the first period of stable confrontation, which never challenged, and the status quo. And then there was a period of collapse of the Soviet Union when it seemed that all the problems would have been solved. Just you are political scholars, so I could remind you that in the 70s and the 80s there was despair about the degradation of Europe. There were huge problems in the United States, but then all of a sudden, God sent an opportunity. So this infatuation with success was prolonged, and we have grown a cadre elites which absolutely are unable to understand how to live in the world of crisis. They're rejecting this world, crisis and challenges. They're rejecting that. And they're trying to siphon off their rejection into in the Ukrainian crisis, hoping that that would help. If Russia doesn't win, quote unquote, over Ukraine, then it could only postpone the further degradation of the war of the Western system. But Russia would probably win, though I'm happy about the word victory, because that means a lot of suffering for our people in Russia and for our people in Ukraine. They will be our probably eventually again, but not most of them. But this war is or special operation is a pain in my heart.
Well, before we finish, I was wondering if we could ask a very specific question, because people initially focused a lot on this very close strategic partnership between Russia and China. Now people shifted a bit focus to Russia and India, but one country which is now seemingly getting very, very close to Russia is Iran. I mean, during the Syrian crisis, war, Russia and Iran obviously got very close. There was a lot of discussion how this could be a very, from a conflict-specific partnership to draw on this to make it a wider strategic partnership in terms of economic connectivity and across the board. I was just wondering how, from this north-south corridor, how do you see the partnership with Iran developing? Because this is something that is making many, especially in Washington, shaking their boots. So I'm just curious if you had made any thoughts about this.
Russia was a European-oriented country during the last. Iran is one of the re-emerging civilizations which I have mentioned when I was talking about this great transition which we are living through, when because of this earthquake which had started about 15 years ago, now we see that there are re-emerging civilizations, re-emerging powers, etc. Iran is one of them. And in 10 to 15 years, if there's no nuclear war, it will be one of the 10 or less most influential countries of the world, like Turkey, like Indonesia. It is not really emerging, it's emerging because Indonesia still have a relatively shallow history. But look, India, obviously, the superpower of the future, one way or another. Arabs are becoming more and more independent and more self-sufficient. So there will be a lot of crises in the world and a lot of shifts. But the earthquake, which is happening, is going to bring to us a new reality in about 10 to 15 years. And Iran will be one of the leaders of this new reality, including it has a very strange political system, which is, by the way, a democracy, for better or for worse. Ideologically, it's strange to many of us, but it has one of the most educated societies in the world, including women. And it's only a question of when they will emerge as a world power. That's why I have been criticizing my government and my people that we didn't build the southern corridors, which are now at last being built, because the most important corridors of communications, and not only east-west, which we are building, though of course slower than I would love it to, but north-south, including through Altai to China, and then to the ASEAN countries, and of course to Iran, and then to the Middle East. That will be the Greater Eurasia, which is being built one way or another. And in 10, 15 years, Shanghai Organization would be their major source of power in the world, though it is developing. It has been developing rather slowly because of the neglect of many elites, including in Beijing and in Moscow, of the capacities of the organization, and of course because Beijing and Moscow also competed for the leadership. Now it is clear that that process is behind us. So if I'm a student, or you have a student, I would invest. I would advise to invest them into the Greater Eurasia project. It is fascinating culturally too, because most of the cultures of the world, except one which has disappeared completely, that's Inca and Aztec, have been in Eurasia. And of course in northern Africa. Now, what is happening is simply unbelievable. And I'm extremely happy that I have contributed to the process of re-emergence of Eurasia, not only an economic, political, and power center, but of this great cultural, multicolored world which we are returning Of course, for you and me as Europeans, that is a bit challenging. But believe me, I mean, when I teach myself to read Chinese poetry or literature, I understand it. I mean, that they are as great as Dante.
I can vouch for that. I mean, one of my great moments, well, two of my great moments of revelation were when I, as a student, started to read Indian philosophy. As a Greek, because I'm of Greek origin, I had been very much assuming that Greek philosophy was the first great philosophies, and then I started reading Indian philosophies, and I realized that this was emphatically not the case. And the other was when I started to become acquainted with Chinese painting, which again opened up an entirely different understanding of what another culture and non-European culture can do, and that of course opened the way to many things. Most Europeans, most Westerners, don't make that transition or haven't made that transition yet. And I just wanted, if I could, just to talk about what I think is ultimately the core relationship still in the Eurasian partnership, which is the one between China and Russia. And one of the complex things about it is that it's difficult to put a precise point on when it started and how it evolved, and the history of this isn't fully developed at the moment. We haven't got real academic studies about it. We don't know what kind of interactions there were, but certainly it seems to me to have had its roots at least going back to the late 1980s. And then where do you think this relationship is at the moment, this Chinese-Russian relationship? Because this is the thing that suddenly over the last year or so, 2 years, principally since the new administration came to power in Washington, they suddenly seem to have woken up to the fact that this relationship between the Chinese and the Russians exists. And you read in all these intricate, these extraordinary foreign policy magazines that proliferate in America, the importance of trying to break this relationship up, and the suggestion that some made that, and I've seen that. I saw an article, and I think it was the National Interest, create a war in Ukraine. This is in August 2021. Create a war in Ukraine, defeat Russia there, and then redirect the defeated Russia's policies into an anti-Chinese direction. So, you're getting that kind of thinking now. But where do you actually see the relationship at the moment between the Chinese and the Russians? I mean, how close is it really? Or how is it evolving?
For the answer of this question, of course, you have to be directed to my colleagues, and Professor Diesen knows that we at the faculty not only have 7 out of 8 best foreign policy specialists now in Russia, and maybe 2 or 3 them could be included into the world 10. But we also have a few best Chinese specialists. So my answer would not be based on my own findings, though of course I have a lot of contacts with the Chinese. I follow them, but rather on the analysis of my colleagues. For the time being, the Russian-Chinese relationship is on a very safe basis. It is in the strategic interests of both countries. And for the time being, and well, first of all, I mean, we don't need a hostile relationship anyway, which was introduced by Mao and Khrushchev because of their ideological differences, which was one of the biggest strategic mistakes of the Soviet Union. I don't know how the Chinese assess that. Now, however, now they are on a solid base. Economic relations are growing like mad, and they will be growing. Now, the Chinese cars are everywhere in Moscow, not yet in Novosibirsk or Omsk. And by the way, great, I'm thinking about buying a Chinese car if I need to replace my old German limousine. If I continue, of course, active working, then I need a limousine anywhere. However, the Chinese are coming, but they're coming very correctly. They are very well understanding that Russians are a supreme sovereign power, and they couldn't impose something on Russia. Now, I could tell you a few funny stories, but about our relationship and about their analysis. But the idea on the Chinese side is that Russia is a supreme sovereign power and power of warriors. You should be friendly with it first. Second, interestingly enough, our relationship with China, unlike our relationship with Europe, is much healthier because it is not a question of ideological or spiritual submission. It's as simple as that. Russians love Russian. Chinese love Russian religion. We do not understand, but we like the Chinese. But they could not impose their views, their ideology, or their philosophy on Russia. That's clear. So there will be a balancing act for about 10, 15 years, 20 years. After that, we shall see. If Russia survives this period of challenges as a strong, sovereign, and relatively powerful nation, it has all chances to become the balancer in the Eurasia. Also, we must understand that the Chinese are not seeking at this juncture any kind of infiltration towards the north. There are no Chinese in Russia, to speak. Now, while the southern Siberia is will be developed, now we shall see by whom. I would love to see it developed not only by Russians, but by Iranians, maybe Europeans, Indians, because it will be the best place in the world, and because of ecology, climate, etc., etc. But if Russia does not collapse, which is a slight possibility, but very slight, we shall have a very good relationship with China. But it will not be a relationship over submission. It will be not a relationship with of senior or junior brother. It will be a relationship between different friendly civilizations, which are dependent on each other, because China could not survive long term without resources of Russia, while we could not survive and prosper without the brains and technological resources. We have brains, but we don't have technological resources of China.
I mean, can I just finish that, add to that, that's coming from the capital of a former imperial power, a country that is friends and allies is always, in the end, more secure than a country that has many other countries that it's trying to control. So from a Chinese point of view, I would have thought having a good relationship with an independent Russia is far better than any other kind of relationship with Russia that could possibly exist. I mean, I can't see why the Chinese would want to try and control things in Moscow. It would be an impossible feat for them, and it would only cause them problems, and it would weaken their overall position. And I think they're intelligent enough to understand that.
Now, they have been a super imperial power during the first 2 millennia of their development. They are the oldest living, and I would say not only civilization, but I would say political civilization in the world. They have been, they have developed kind of a thinking that it's better to have friends who pay tributes, or to whom we pay tributes, rather than to have colonies. Number one. The second is that, of course, but they are now living also in unbelievably strange circumstances for them, because they secured for themselves since, I think, 16th century, a very nice niche where they dominated mostly benevolently. Yeah, now they are, of course, up to become the first world power in the world. We'll see how they will develop. And by the way, to help to direct the development, the concept of Greater Eurasia was developed, which Professor Diesen contributed to a lot. Because it is a concept which also, in one of its aspects, helps China to find its comfortable place, but not as a dominant, but as a leading power in a group of proud and powerful civilizations, and also in the web of new interconnections. In our previous history, we thought that only maritime interconnections were dominant. It is not true anymore, or will not be true, because of aviation, because of technology, and now of transportation. I think land communications will be much more important than they used to be. But anyway, the world which we are moving to is a world which I like. The question is how to avoid a disaster on the way to this great world.
Professor Karaganov, thank you so much for your time and your insights on the views from Moscow. We really appreciate this, and thanks again. And look forward to being back in Moscow soon. And
drop in whenever you come, and it was a pleasure to chat on serious but pleasant matters during the shiny and very frosty Russian days, about -24. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
It was a pleasure
Thank
to
you.
meet you, Mr.